Reith.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this time we are reading Tree Stories by Stefano Mancuso, which was released last month, April 2023, I think.
And it's not actually even available worldwide yet. It's publication forthcoming in Canada and stuff.
That's quite fun. We've got an advanced copy here.
Yeah.
This is a fun little book. This is quite a bit lighter than anything we've been tackling recently, so I think it's going to be a short episode. But it is. It was a wheeze to read this. Quite amusing.
Yeah, 100%. It is. It kind of reminds me of Orwell's essays. Very sort of familiar, conversational. There's quite a lot of comedy and irony, lots of sort of editorializing in all of the first person editorializing about everything. It's a very, very, very light read.
Yeah, it's I'd absolutely recommend it as a read. Even we're going to talk about it, we're going to summarize it, but it is absolutely worth the read because it is cute and fun. The author's shtick is that he calls himself a plant neurobiologist, specifically, he's in the field of botany. He's really into plant intelligence and communication among plants and stuff like this. There's an interesting article in The Guardian that was a kind of interview with him that I will link in the show notes. But a lot of the content of that interview isn't really in the book. The plant intelligence stuff doesn't really show up. He has some fascinating points in the interview about the fact that you can anesthetize plants in the same way you can do animals. Suggest they're conscious, or they're kind of their nervous systems are more diffuse than ours. Animals tend to specialize their functions into organs. Plants don't. Plants diffuse their functions through their bodies. But there's a lot there, and they communicate with each other. What was the recent thing where it's plants, when cut, emit a high-pitched scream that we can't hear, but dogs can, What? Did you see that shit? No, they make sound.
What the hell?
Yeah, let's.
That's so wild.
I could have sworn you knew this, but let's quickly Google this because it's fucking crazy.
No, I did not know this. Holy shit.
Anyway, if you Google for it, there's a shitload of stuff there. I'm not gonna track down an author. bioarchive.org. Plants emit informative airborne sounds under stress. Ultrasonic screams when they're either threatened or attacked, and so they can communicate with each other chemically, but they can just fucking talk as well, which is kind of insane.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's insane.
I feel like you need to cut in that Werner Herzog documentary voiceover where he's talking about the jungle.
Taking a close look at what's around us, there is some sort of a harmony. It is the harmony of overwhelming and collective murder. And we have to become humble in front of this overwhelming misery and overwhelming fornication, overwhelming growth, and overwhelming lack of order. Even the stars up here in the sky look like a mess. There is no harmony in the universe. We have to get acquainted to this idea that there is no real harmony as we have conceived it. But when I say this all full of admiration for the jungle. It is not that I hate it. I love it. I love it very much. But I love it against my better judgment.
That's fucking nuts. But
he was more right than he ever knew. Oh my god.
Yeah. And
holy shit.
Yeah, they communicate, right? And the crazy thing is they're ultrasonic apparently in the range that dogs could hear. So but we don't. So, but that gets to a lot of the content of this book, right? That like, we in the colloquial sense, and we in like the practice of science, seem to be really reluctant to take lessons from the plant world. And even when the evidence is presented, seem really reluctant to take it seriously, or to like take plants for what they are, right? And it's kind of one of the big themes here, that like we just don't take plants seriously, and that's something that the author is trying to correct.
Yeah, so it's the book itself has quite scarce information on plant intelligence. It is actually a lot more about sort of how prolific plants and especially trees are, and how we like continuously, almost willfully ignore things about them, despite them being like everywhere around us. Like just this screening out, mental screening out that we do of anything to do with plants, and this extreme cognitive bias towards an emphasis on the human, the animal, and sort of the maybe you could say like the orderly, inert physical world.
Yeah, exactly right. And it like a lot of the stories in the Tree Stories book are kind of about the way that plants intersect with like science and the practice of science in various ways, and like how even there it's like it's still not really kind of admitted. Like you would think that in our scientific investigations we'd be better at this kind of thing, but it's still an uphill struggle to get any kind of evidence from the plant world to be taken seriously.
Yeah, it's not a matter of scientific capacity to become aware of these facts. It's a matter of sort of like willful ignorance, is really the thesis that we get here.
Yeah, and the author points out that like the animal world makes up a very small like minority of life on Earth, like, and to try to tell a story about life but just forgetting about 80-something% of life.
Wasn't even like more than that. It was like plant matter. It was like it wasn't like the animals like sub 5% or something like that.
Something fucking crazy like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really low compared to the amount of plants in the world. Yeah.
And trying to tell a story about life in general without taking life in general into account is pretty weird. And like I guess it kind of feeds back onto some of the content we've covered in the show. Like, I mean, Beer's viable system model and stuff is a quite an animal kind of model. I mean, it's modeled on the human body or whatever, but like it leaves you wondering then, like, it kind of like, does it generalize well to all life forms? Would, if you tried to do like a plant-based VSM, would it be a little different?
Right. Yeah. It seems like, yeah, I mean, there's the question of plants, of ecosystems, that is sort of brought up in Brain of the Firm. And Beer just sort of says, well, it's not really forward thinking enough. It's not really, how could I say it? Like, it doesn't really have like the system 4 functions that animals have, that humans have especially. And that is something that made him decide not to focus on an ecosystem as an example. But also, like, there are a number of things we know now about plants that Beer had no idea about at all, right? Like, we know a lot more about plant intelligence now, probably not very much, but a lot more than we used to. In the last, say, 20 years, we've come to learn a lot more. So it might require some reassessment. And then you have like really weird stuff like the those soaps that we were looking at in the GIU Discord the other day, where it's like, this is neither a colony nor is it an organism.
This is weird shit.
It is neither a body with organs, nor is it a body without organs. It is, in fact, some other thing that is totally liminal and screws up the entire framework. Uh,
That's the book. That's the book that Deleuze never got to write. You know, the secret third thing.
yeah. Well, and then like I feel like even the stuff that we've learned about trees, the sorts of things that are mentioned in terms of tree intelligence, but also like tree communication, like this thing in, I think it's in, was it in chapter 3 where they have the trunk, the stump that is still alive is kept alive by the trees surrounding it. Yeah, like that kind of thing, I think really sort of even undermines the concepts of like the arborescent that you get in Deleuze. Because like trees don't actually function the way that the that Deleuze thought they did at that time, or that people generally thought they did.
They're more rhizomatic than he gave them credit for.
They're more rhizomatic than he ever appreciated or anyone else did at that time. Yeah, so it's like, oh, like even trees are not arborescent in the way that like traditional biology thought about them. Yeah, so it is like, it's obviously not a slight against Deleuze because he had no idea about this stuff. No one did in any like established scientific context. But as far as like our sort of future theorizations, we do need to take these things into account, and that's kind of the point that is being made in this book here, right?
Yeah. It's things. I guess it lines up with the. There's a funny kind of rhyming to the way that all turned out. That like, because Deleuze is always kind of like, we should try to think things in this more diffuse kind of way, and think kind of in a mixed mode of rhizomatic and arborescent kind of thinking. But then it just turns out the trees are like that anyway. It's very fucking
their trees are already that thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Very strange. And like, I mean, I think one of the things that's never really stated but is implied strongly is that like we would benefit a lot from just paying a lot more attention to trees and learning from them, and taking fewer lessons from animals maybe, and just like spending more of our time looking at trees.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that thing where we spend so much time like thinking like, oh, what if we encountered aliens? It's like we do it like every day of our lives.
I walk past one, it's outside my fucking house. I can see it through the window,
Yeah. It's like, undersea creatures are basically aliens to us. But like, even trees, it seems like, are basically aliens in the sense that we had no idea how they operated. And like we couldn't even perceive them screaming all the time.
There's this massive gap between our like perception of our own kind of knowledge of the world and the kind of reality of how much we actually know. Like, and that's what even with you would kind of assume that trees were pretty well understood by now, but it's just not the case, right? Like, and if our knowledge is that flimsy on something that should be so familiar, then like it makes the world of reason and science seem a lot fucking smaller than it initially does.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we know a lot about how to make trees into means of production, and that is mostly what we know about trees. It's kind of the impression of what I have learned from this book.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's maybe get started. Like, the prologue had me from the fucking first couple of words, because like I'm just going to read out this first two paragraphs because this had me hooked immediately. So quoting from the prologue here. After decades of keeping community with plants, I seem to perceive their presence not only in every place on our planet, but also in the stories of each and every one of us. At first I figured that a heightened perception of the vegetable world was the normal consequence of my sensitivity to these silent beings. And that, as happens to anyone who develops a strong taste for something, I had started to notice the object of my interest wherever I went, Anyone who has fallen in love knows what I am talking about. That strange sensation that everything in the universe, no matter how distant or marginal, appears to be related in some way to the object of our affection. Every event, every song, the weather conditions, the stones in the sidewalk you're walking on, everything has a precise echo in your own little love story. Now, I'm an absolute sap, and this had me going right from the fucking beginning. I knew I would love this book.
Yeah, but I mean, I also like I also think it's a great introduction in the sense that, like, you know, he's really introducing somebody who is very perceptive about the world and about people and the way we think, right? Like, because this is, you know, a real phenomenon, absolutely, and so it hooks you in emotionally. It's quite romantic, but also it is like very perceptive. The point being that no, it's not simply the fact that, you know, he loves plants. It's actually the plants are everywhere.
Right. It's not just a fascination. It's not just a crush.
Yeah, yeah. It's like okay, I have thought about it, and I think I can assert with a certain degree of assurance that the answer is no. Uh, I am reasonably sure of it, that I live with plants, study them, and that they are undoubtedly the center of my interests is not related to their appearance at the start of every story. It is simply a consequence of their enormous number and of their being the source of life on this planet. This is an indisputable fact. How could it be otherwise? We animals are only 0.3% of our planet's biomass, while plants are 85%. It is obvious that every story that takes place on our planet has, in one way or another, a leading role for plants. So, you know, it's just like beyond the obsession. It's pretty easy to run into them because they're everywhere.
Yeah, it's fabulous, and let's see. So, chapter 1, "Planting Liberty," is maybe some of the funniest stuff I've read in a while. He kind of goes over this really amusing kind of anecdote of like you know, he'd attend these like book selling kind of secondhand book exchange sort of events, and he has this like arch nemesis who's like a lot better at like getting to the good books early, and like will like vault over tables like a panther to like seize his prey and shit like that. It's all very amusing.
Yeah, like very much like plays up the rivalry, plays up the intensity of emotion about, like, you know, the competition for getting the best secondhand books of whatever obscure interests that these nerds happen to have, right? Like it's you know, it's very like it's very charming in the sense that the stakes are so low, but the antagonism is so high, and the fact that it's like two like fairly old men scrapping it out over these books is adds to the hilarity. So yeah, it's a very good read, this first chapter here.
And the the author's interest is botany, but then his antagonist, Professor Henri Girard, his interest is botany, but also like revolutionary French history. And at some point along the way, our author manages to snag a book that, like, kind of initially doesn't look like much, but when you open it up, turns out to be a book about the Liberty trees in the Revolution. And you know, the antagonist is very disappointed by this, but they kind of become friends over it and actually collaborate on, you know, analyzing the book and seeing what it's all about. And like it unveils this really fascinating kind of bit of history that in the early years of the French Revolution, it was decided that they were going to plant a bunch of trees, or not plant trees, they were going to transplant trees from the forest into the town squares to like be the emblems of the revolution.
Yes, like they're, you know, this document was written by Abbe Grégoire, who some of you who've listened to Revolutions might remember. But the criteria that he gives is that the perfect tree must, one, be strong enough to withstand the coldest climate. Otherwise, a severe winter would be enough to eliminate it from the soil of the Republic. Two, be selected from among the tallest trees, ranging from 80 to 130 feet tall, because the strength and magnificence of a tree inspires a sense of respect that is naturally tied to the object of which it is the symbol. Number three, have a circumference that occupies an ample extension of terrain. Number four, have an extension of shade large enough to provide citizens shelter from the rain and heat under its hospitable branches. Number five, be long-lived, and if it cannot be eternal, at least be chosen from plants whose life can go on for centuries. And number six, be able, finally, to grow in solitude in all the regions of the Republic.
When I read this, I immediately thought of Elden Ring with the Erd Tree and the minor Erd Trees and shit like that. It's like,
100%. Yes, and therefore, of course, the Liberty Tree must be an oak, right? It is the most majestic of European trees, and
yeah, it's the only tree that's going to cut it with those criteria, right?
Yeah. And then there's all this sort of talk about, like, could people have actually, like, done these transplants? They're so complicated and difficult even in modern times. Like, it's sort of like they compare it to, like, building the pyramids. Like it's like these primitive people of the 18th century. Like, how could they have done this? Is it even conceivable? Was this all a fancy? Was it ever actually accomplished? All these questions come up doing this historical research, because this particular document by the Abbé Grégoire is, like, not very well known. And it's kind of ignored, like most things about trees.
Yeah, right. It's and that's the thing, right? Because, like, the document contains an illustration that they what grabs their eye is that it seems to be, it's a map of France, but, like, it has these, like, very thin lines that look like a root network, and where the roots converge, those are locations that the Liberty trees were. But then they can go look up in an archive the actual, like, the bigger version of this illustration that this one is a reproduction of, and it's less than half of the actual illustration, because it is a root network, but then the other half of it that's missing is like an Erd tree. It's this huge fucking oak tree that's, like, spread, that, like, of which those are the roots.
Yes, and it spans from France to America, right? The root network, so to speak, of these like sister trees connecting sister cities and sister republics.
And so the document, like, it puts forward, like, a kind of, like, an absolute majesty to this, and, like, a kind of centrality of this project to the project of the revolution, and yet it's basically forgotten. Not many of the Liberty trees survived. I don't even know if there are any still standing today.
There are. It's like the ones in, like, the most obscure remote places are the ones that have survived. Because basically every time the reactionaries took power, they would cut them all down as well, they're the symbol of the revolution, of the Republic. Well, we need to destroy them in order to reestablish the kingdom, right? So they're like sort of the unfortunate, like, what would you say? Like, they're like the unfortunate victims caught in the middle of the revolutionary struggle between the forces of revolution and the forces of reaction. This ends up, like, leading to most of them being destroyed, despite the fact that they are, in fact, very large and very healthy and so on and so on. It doesn't really matter, because they get wrecked. And then on top of that, the whole network is forgotten. So it's like people will just sort of, like, be like, oh, where did this tree come from anyway? And then, oh, there's this Liberty tree thing. Huh. And this is an exact bookend with the final chapter of the book that describes these moon trees, where these seeds were brought on one of the Apollo missions to the moon, and then brought back to Earth and planted around America. And I guess they sent them to some other countries as like a diplomatic thing too. Yeah, they did. And then you know, like you had like President Gerald Ford being like, "This is a symbol of like our greatest accomplishments as a republic, as Americans, blah blah blah." And then like everybody just completely forgot about them.
Right, and the only reason it ever comes up again is that like there's like I don't know, there's one of these things planted outside a school in Idaho, and one of the fucking secretaries calls up NASA and is like, "What the fuck is a moon tree?"
Yeah, why is there a plaque describing this as a moon tree?
and even NASA are like, "We don't know, like what the fuck?" And
they have to like go and do all this archival research to figure out like what happened with these trees that they themselves planted.
they sent to the fucking moon, you know. And like if there was like a cat that went to the moon, you better believe that would be a fucking celebrity. But like plants that went there and came back and got planted everywhere, as again as it like these like, you know, nation state projects are plenty capable of like borrowing trees as symbology when it's kind of useful, but then get pretty quickly forgotten. Yeah, which is odd. And so the book they have here in front of them is like one of these very few artifacts that like makes a point of just how kind of majestic this shit was, and like how, I mean, you know, these are revolutionary times. Like, why were they spending their time talking about fucking planting trees and shit? Well, it must have been important, right? Like, it must have been of some importance to take up that much kind of time and energy. And as they say, like, moving a big oak from the forest into the town square is not a small undertaking.
Yeah, and the even funnier thing is like, after the reactionaries cut the Liberty trees down, in 1848, the revolutionaries plant a bunch more. Like they go back and try it again, and then they get cut down again. When Louis Napoleon takes over.
Yeah, ridiculous.
So it's like very like, like it was important enough not only to do it once but to try it twice. Yeah.
A fun little anecdote. Chapter 2 is planting cities, in which the author makes a, you know, an easy argument in my books, because I'm very on board for this. An argument for greening cities by quite a bit, like substantial vegetable incursion into cities. He's not wrong, largely. The one bit I kind of take some issue with is like, you know, he begins by saying like, I mean, we kind of naturally sort of seem to exclude nature from our domiciles. You know, we kind of draw, even the small hut or whatever draws a distinction between inside and outside. We try to keep the outside on the out and try to, you know, make a separation. I don't know, I quite like being separated from nature when I'm in my home. That's quite nice. Because, I mean, we were talking about this in the green room, but, like, luckily in this house we don't have much of a problem with pests, but, like, sometimes you get some really wacky shit crawling under the doors. You'll need to go and look up a coach horse beetle, because they're pretty fucking weird. They're, like, big, fairly big by British standards, black beetles that kind of look like scorpions. Like, they're long, and their tail can arch up, almost like a scorpion's tail. They make a horrible racket. If you scare them, they'll make a stink and stuff. But, like, you know, the problem with them is, like, in autumn, when the leaves are on the ground, they like to nest under piles of leaves, and then they'll just kind of come inside the house as well. And it's like, I would really rather they not, you know what I mean? I like nature to be on the outside, because, like, it's bad enough when my daughter finds like a spider in her bed and she's freaked out by that, but it would be even worse if it was a fucking giant centipede or a coach horse beetle, or like, I don't know, there's a fucking tree growing through the window or something. You know, it's like, I kind of do like the separation.
Yeah, no, and like I feel like, in my experience, the closer you get to living out in nature, the more intense the desire to have that separation becomes. It's not the it's not the opposite. It's not like you get in touch with nature and then you feel like, oh yeah, whatever, just like, you know, I'll just like go sleep in this pile of leaves with all these beetles crawling all over me. It's chill. Like, it's not like that. You feel like, you know, oh yeah, I like being outside. but I also like to have my own space. Like, and you know, the intensity increases because the amount of effort required to maintain that separation becomes more and more difficult, right? So it's like, you know, you have to basically treat like the sort of like cloakroom or like the boot room of your house as like an airlock, and like nothing from outside comes into that room that doesn't belong there, and you never leave both doors open. If you do, you're asking for ants to get in, flies to get in, mosquitoes to get in, whatever it is. Like, there'll be everything in there in no time, and dirt everywhere. And the thing is, like, you know, yeah, like even my mom used to live in a log cabin, and there would just be like flies that would just nest in the walls because they have holes in them because they're made out of trees, right? And so it would just be like in the late summer, you would just have continuous swarms of flies that would hatch every day.
Oh my God.
And just you know, fill up your house.
They just keep respawning.
And you had to like go around with like a vacuum cleaner, like a shop vac, and just like suck them off the walls because there were so many of them.
Fucking sucks. Oh my God.
And like, it was awful.
It's fucking terrible.
Yeah. And you know, I just had like an infestation of moths in my house. They were eating my clothes. They were eating my food. They were spoiling food. Like, it was like a month-long battle to try to get rid of them, and I don't even know if they're gone or not because I'm out of the country right now. And so, like, I very strongly feel the importance of this divide. It is actually something that we kind of, I wouldn't say we can't live without it, but like, how could we be happy without having something like that?
I suddenly don't feel quite so bad about the little roly-polies that come under the door sometimes in this house, you know? That sounds fucking terrible.
No, and I mean, there's like, the weird thing is, like, to a certain degree, the reason why the moth infestation in my apartment is so bad is because there's no predators for the moths, because there's no other life forms other than us that live in there, and like microorganisms, right? So they can just, the population could just explode. They could just have a field day because the ecosystem on the inside is so simple that it's like just completely vulnerable to infestation.
It's totally deprived of natural variety.
Yeah, like we don't have any spiders to eat them. We don't have any birds. We don't have anything like that. But it's also not the case that you could just be like, well, then obviously you just need to like fill up your house with like a menagerie of different insects, because I don't think that's really what we're aiming for either.
No. And so I think while the author is very on the right track with like planting a lot more vegetation in cities, like he's not even just talking about planting trees. It's like we should be like carpeting the sides of buildings in plants, and just every fucking surface should be covered in moss. And that's kind of it. It's like if that's the case, and that helps a lot with climate change and all that kind of good stuff, I can't help but wonder how much worse the pest situation is going to be around here. That's just the thing that I can't help but wonder about. And is it going to be like, so, you know, if you work in an office building, you know, it's pretty bad if it gets flies or, like, as you said, moths or whatever. But then it'll be a lot worse if the moths and the wasps are duking it out to see who dominates, you know, right in front of your desk, you know, this kind of thing.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like, certainly with modern building techniques, we can maintain this barrier fairly effectively, right? In terms of having like, you know, like double glazed windows and this kind of stuff, right? Like you can air gap the outside and the inside, but you do wonder. I think that, yeah, like basically what he says is I believe that that cultural heritage, including, in a certain sense, our adaptive memory regarding how our home must be constituted, plays a prevailing role. Much of our ancestral memory concerns the necessity to defend ourselves. From the moment that the first human felt the urge to build a hut in order to settle in some place, the inevitable consequence of this decision was to trace out a separation between his refuge and the nature surrounding it. Defense against predators, whether animals or humans, has always been an essential element in the construction of our settlements. The separation between outside the city, where nature reigns supreme, and inside, where, on the contrary, nature is completely excluded, is an ancestral remnant of those distant times. And I do agree with that. Like, I've also lived in, like, central Prague, which is one of these cities that he talks about where there's like no plants at all except for like ornamental plants on, you know, the facades of buildings and this kind of stuff, right? Like, and it did kind of, like, beyond the heat island effect, which is a real problem, or the air quality or whatever, like, it did kind of have like a weird psychological effect on me to live in a world without plants. It was disturbing. It was upsetting. I definitely agree that like there is a sort of dialectical third step here where you could have a reconciliation. It's just, yeah, again, like, don't think it's going to be simple. Like, just because you have like green roofs and you have like plants growing on the sides of buildings everywhere, don't think that that's not going to create their own issues, because it will. But of course, the situation we're living in now is completely untenable, and we must change, right? Like, we have to change this. Like, our cities are going to become even more unlivable than they already are.
Yeah. There is one other thing that I thought was a kind of fascinating point that was raised in this chapter, that you know, he's talking about like urbanization and how it's speeding up. Like we seem to be concentrating more and more in cities, and that this acceleration toward urbanization is very contrary to the way our activities have been in the past, right? Like, we've tended to expand the territory we occupy. We've tended to explore and go and find new places to live and all that kind of shit. But that really reached its peak with the landings on the moon, right? And then we turned back and then contracted into smaller and smaller spaces, which, I don't know, like in a sense, for, you know, the whole, I mean, it doesn't translate exactly, but like the half-Earth socialism stuff, it's like, well, you know, shrinking into tighter and tighter spaces would be a good thing if we also weren't like, you know, smashing down everything else to make agricultural land to feed everyone in cities. But, you know, it's a very interesting reversal of the dynamic. And
yeah, as he mentions here, he says like 77% of this enormous area of agricultural land we have subtracted from forests and natural ecosystems is used today to raise cattle, and only 23% is used for the production of vegetable food. It's like, that is astounding. I mean, it's a thing that, of course, like any like vegan who's done some research will probably know, but like, it is really incredible that, like, as a species, we've all concentrated in these cities. Like, a vast majority of us have come to concentrate in cities over, like, you know, that period from the middle of the 20th century. And correspondingly, we've like turned massive hinterlands into nothing other than production systems for cattle. It's just like profoundly weird if you think about it as like a space alien, you know, thinking about this planet. It's like, what the hell just happened? What are they doing down there?
yeah, the rapid reorganization of the biosphere must be pretty fucking weird to watch from a satellite. A follow-on point that's made is this, I think, quite interesting thing, that like organisms that are capable of expansion and colonizing different environments tend to be generalists, right? They're able to survive in all kinds of situations, and then the opposite is specialists. And I don't know. We seem to be switching from generalist to specialist, right? That we're specializing more and more in urban living, and our environment is a lot simpler for that. And I don't know. It's kind of like we might be losing some capacity to adapt by doing that, becoming overfit to a niche. You know.
Yeah, well, we also have exactly the problem with like my apartment and the mobs, right? Is that like our cities become so simplified that they can be overrun with like one thing because there's such a monoculture. There's such a simple system biologically, and so complex and rigid that they become very, very, very vulnerable at the same time that they are extremely powerful in like revolutionizing the entire planet to serve their needs. Yeah.
Yeah, it's and I don't know. Like a lot of what he's talking about then is the way that like concentration in cities obviously has its advantages, right? Like, and there's a reason it's a feedback loop, right? That like, you know, you want to be close to amenities, you want to be frankly close to other people for like, I don't know, dating opportunities and friendship and shit like that, right? Like you're gonna have a better time doing that in a city than you are out in the sticks, and everyone knows that. It's why everyone wants to move to the city. But that kind of becoming overfit to this peculiar niche has its substantial risks, right? And one of those big risks is climate change. That like, and the problem of heat islands in cities, right? That like we're becoming very specialistly adapted to these very particular environments that are not terribly hospitable, actually.
No, they're incredibly fragile as in any sort of like longer term outlook, because they're so dependent on so many complex systems that are ludicrously energy intensive the cities are susceptible to the global warming to which they themselves are contributing. So it is like very it's very much like a one of those like local optimums, where it's like you know there are incentives, there are reasons to do this thing within a local context, but if you look at it in a broader context, it seems completely unfathomable like why you would pursue this path of development from the big picture, right? And this is a thing that like beer talks about a lot, right? Just sort of like lamenting the modern world. Yeah.
Yeah. The author takes kind of more, like, I mean, does a fair bit of lamenting the modern world, but, like, takes a step in a sort of more positive direction by bringing in, like, he's kind of saying that, like, the very rapid transformation has meant that we're not really yet understanding what cities even are, and that you can see cities as organisms, as, like, complex adaptive systems with their own metabolisms and their own you know, an organism has a relationship with an environment. And, you know, he brings in like Patrick Geddes, who kind of pioneered this way of thinking about things, and just like, you know, there's a lot of good stuff here about it's very different from the way an urban planner would see things, right? Like, see, instead Geddes advocated for seeing cities basically as organisms with their own complex internal dynamics, and their complex metabolic relation to their environment.
Yes, and sort of the you know the point is that there's been people for the longest time trying to make arguments about why greening cities would be a good idea. So, like, he points even back to, like, John Evelyn writing in 1661 about, like, the value of greening, and identifying, like, why the air quality is so bad in London and how using greening techniques would actually improve the issue. And you know, it's just gone on and on that people have pointed these things out. And even like actually the book, and like this book that Evelyn wrote was like the first thing the Royal Society ever published, the British Royal Society, and Yeah, just didn't really amount to anything. Um, but I think the other contrast that the other point that he's trying to illustrate is that, like, how can we say this? Like, yeah, I think this is something that comes up a bit in the next chapter, maybe, but this idea that, like, mutual aid, like, yeah, he talks about Kropotkin and mutual aid in this chapter, number 2, and it's um he makes this point that, like, okay, we think about evolution and we think about competition because of Darwinism, right? And there is a fair amount of validity to that point of view if you look at animals as the primary subject of evolution. Now, it's not to say there isn't cooperation among animals, because there is. But the thing is, if you look at plants, you see that the tendency towards cooperation is overwhelmingly strong versus the one that you see in animals. And then if you think that, animals are only 0.3% of the biomass on the planet, and there's an overwhelming tendency towards cooperation among plants, it suggests that our understanding of evolution is really skewed, because these plants are actually very successful. Arguably, in quantitative measures, they're much more successful than we are. And this focus on cooperation might be something that's actually necessary to keep cities going, given the fact that they're very resource intensive. They need a lot of stabilization, and also they need a lot of sort of, like, mutual stabilization in a complex system. And these are things that plants can provide. They're things they've evolved to do. There is sort of a whole other world suggested by this understanding of life. And if we had the humility to not put animals, like, 100% extreme close-up focus in the middle of the frame at all times, and view plants as, like, beneath notice, maybe this other world would be a better world than the one that we are creating. But we just have a massive mental block about it. And it doesn't matter how many essays or how many academic papers are published about plant evolution that validate Kropotkin's ideas. We'll just keep ignoring them unless we really do a complete flip in our way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely right. A flip to like seeing cities as organisms, and filling them with plant organisms, seeing this kind of taking the lessons from mutual aid, taking lessons from plants, doing all that kind of stuff. And it's like that maybe then, the cities or our living spaces could be survivable rather than death traps, which is what they're turning into.
Yeah, and it's like, you look at mutual aid, right? It's like, okay, mutual aid is really hard for humans to do, right? Like, we have plenty of competitive instincts that push in the opposite direction that from mutual aid, even though we have instincts that also push in that direction, right? Like, there's a sort of conflictual relationship in human behavior between the two, and it makes mutual aid something that's not easy to do. Like, we tend to generally privilege our close relations over other people, and it takes quite a lot of work to make us do otherwise. But for plants, that's really not true. Right? It's like that's actually easier for them to do. So what if we were able to harness that fact and create sort of communist society that has a lived environment that emphasizes that characteristic of mutual aid, and does not push us to engage in more and more competitive behavior that is self-destructive.
Yeah. Yeah, wouldn't that be lovely? You know? It would be good stuff. I would like that quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, the author is weaves together a fascinating kind of set of references there. And yeah, I would. I don't know. For all my reservations about having fucking big bugs around or whatever, you know, when I look out the window here, I mean, it's reasonably green, but like a lot of this city isn't. You know, and you know, what would it be like to walk around town and just have fucking plants everywhere? You know, and to live like that. It's not just an aesthetic thing. Like, wouldn't it be cool to look at some plants? It would be what's different about life there? You know, seems like it'd be very different.
Yeah, like he points out that, like, according to this online database, like Vancouver, BC in Canada is like the most plant heavy city in the world. And I've lived there for quite a bit of time. And yeah, like there is a fair amount of sort of like overgrowing of the city in the suburbs and stuff at very large parks. There's like Stanley Park, there's the UBC endowment grounds, like these large forested areas that kind of probably bias the measures in that direction. But the downtown is not really any different than any other big city. So I feel like, you know, it may be biased in that direction. It may be sort of an outlier, but I don't think it's really the paradigm of greening that we need to find as an example. Like, I feel like here in Utrecht, there's you know, there's more sort of thatch roofs, there's more green roofs, there's more sort of like living spaces that are complicated and have lots of organisms living in them than I felt like existed in Vancouver. So we just have to kind of like look around and cherry pick the examples we can find and see if there's some way that we could have, like, you know, some living space to ourselves that isn't constantly infested, while also having a very green and rich environment to live in that isn't incredibly toxic to us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The third chapter, Planting the Underground, continues the mutual aid theme with basically the sort of problem that some botanists kind of found with, like, they would occasionally find like tree stumps, like that were, you know, cut down trees that were still alive even long after they'd been cut down, and trying to solve this kind of mystery.
Yeah, like decades later, this tree stump is still alive. Like, it is still functioning as a living tree, despite not having like regrown into a full tree or anything. It's alive decades after being cut down.
It doesn't have photosynthesis or anything like that. What's going on here? And I mean, what it turns out is that you know, the trees in a forest are all connected by their underground root networks. They form a kind of weird superorganism, and they're perfectly happy to share nutrients and to push, like, through hydraulic action, push stuff into the tree stump. Like, I don't know, kind of surprising, but then when you think about it, it's not terribly surprising at all, because there's an evolutionary advantage to not having a rotting stump that's a source of disease right amongst you, because you can't walk away from it. They can't bury their dead, you know? So keeping them alive actually pays off.
Yeah, and also, like, you can still make use of that root network to bridge the gap between other trees, right? Like, it's basically like an infrastructure that you can continue to make use of. And the key thing here is that trees are capable of grafting. And this is essentially like where you take a piece of a tree and you fuse it to another tree, and this forms a new organism that is made up of both, right? And, you know, through like very elaborate means, we can do that as humans with like, organs and so on, like organ donors, organ transplants, that kind of thing. We can do that, but it's like, it's not like our biology is highly amenable to doing so. Whereas with trees, they're very good at doing this, and you know, this characteristic of grafting, which allows you to sort of get the characteristics of both trees, is something that humans have taken advantage of for a very long time to create like new species of trees for like agricultural purposes and that kind of thing, or just like for decorative purposes or what have you. But the funny thing is that we think about grafting in those practical terms, in terms of like decorative purposes or purposes of like means of production. But we didn't really think very much about why are trees able to do this, right? Like we just took it for granted that the trees could do this. And the most important thing about it was that we could take advantage of it. But then, through this experiment, they sort of figure out like, oh, actually they do this because like they can function, as you said, as a sort of superorganism that is not really individual in the same way that animals are.
Right. They do root grafting constantly. That's like underground. They're all actually glued together. It's fucking bizarre, but like...
Yeah, so it's like, it is known that like there are some competitive behaviors among trees, right? Like the parent trees will sort of preferentially send nutrients through the root network to their children, that kind of thing. But like also, if grafting, like you have to take into account root grafting in determining like what is an individual, because that is not open, like that is not clean or clear in the way it is with animals. Because actually, like as these trees grow together, they become a superorganism. And so that kind of like Darwinian preferential resource allocation to your own children becomes more and more muddy and unclear as a result of this. It becomes more of a sort of like fuzzy, localized thing as opposed to a family tree, quote unquote, parents to children preference. And of course, like in human society, we see this to some degree too, right? Like we have like socialism where it's quite fuzzy, or, we have like clan structures or whatever. But I guess it's just to say that like there are these affordances about arboreal biology and plant biology that are just like beyond what we can conceive of as animals, in an intuitive sense, right?
Yeah, it's certainly more difficult to conceive of, and when we do conceive of it, it's kind of framed as like an outlier kind of conception. Like I think it's a lot of what just to touch back on the Deleuze and Guattari thing of like in that chapter on arborescence and rhizomes, like they're kind of getting at like these two modes of thought, and that like we in some ways we have a very strong bias to this like ocular arborescent kind of mode of thought, like where we interpret trees as being individuals and we see their branching pathways, and then we see our own like state-like lineages and shit like that in there. There's a particular mode of thought that's very arborescent. And then there's a mode of thought that's more rhizomatic and more like the root network. And you see the same thing in human societies, right? Like you have, I don't know, like a clan structure or some sort of kinship network that, if you kind of look at the relations between people, is very rhizomatic and very indistinct. Like there's a lot of different interactions going on. But then overlaid on top of it, you have the chieftains and their kind of arborescent branching tree structure of succession and stuff like that. Like, and there does seem to be a very strong tilt, especially in contemporary society, that like towards the arborescent, towards the kind of optical interpretation of trees, and there's something about the state and capital that favors those kinds of metaphors and interpretations.
Yes. The point he makes is I would like the absurdity of this proposition to be clear. Discoveries made in the vegetable kingdom are not thought deserving of any attention unless and until they are replicated in the animal kingdom. Conversely, models whose validity is obviously restricted to the animal world are ipso facto thought to be of universal value. So it's like, why? Why would we think that, right? Like, what is the rational basis for this thought?
Right. it's the major and minor sciences, right? Of Deleuze and Guattari, right? Like there's things that are taken to be universal. They're the major sciences, and then there's the minor stuff that's just, I don't know, like peripheral nerd shit.
And yeah, he gives the example of like, what if there were like a parliament of elected representatives that included all living things? 85% of plant life would have 425 representatives, while the 0.3% of animals would have 1.5. The rest would be assigned to fungi and various microorganisms. So we would have 1.5 that decide for everyone else, according to the human model, when you have like this 500 person body, of which 425 come from plants.
Yeah. Chapter 4, planting music, I thought was interesting, but I don't know there's that much to say about. A lot of it's just about the very special wood that goes into violins, of the Stradivari and so on.
Yeah, it's essentially about the way in which the best trees, these best spruce trees, used to make the best violins in all of human history, right? These exemplars created in Italy were harvested following growth during the Little Ice Age, and it was the sort of moderated climactic extremes and the austere environment in which they grew, which allowed their I guess you could say their internal like cell structure to be like highly regular, and porous in exactly the right way to produce excellent resonance, right? And so, you know, we can try as humans to synthesize these qualities, but in fact, like, it seems that these very specific qualities are found only in climactic conditions that do not exist anymore, and are only as a result of sort of an accident of evolution combined with an accident of climate history, more so than the genius of the luthiers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it, right? And it's kind of it is interesting to meditate on the interaction between the very particular histories of these organisms, and human art, and, you know, these very prized instruments.
Yeah. And it's just like, it's just underscoring, like, you know, no matter how good we get in our instrument crafting and our physical, like our material sciences at this point in time, we still haven't been able to replicate those materials, which are just a result of tree growth, right? And it's just like pointing to something that is held as being incredibly valuable in the human world of aesthetics, that like the vast majority of its value comes from something completely outside of human ingenuity. And we can't, it's like we might be jealous of the trees for creating this thing, but we just can't seem to do it on our own.
Right, we're highly dependent. Like, in so many ways, we're highly dependent on tree growth, you know, on plant growth, and this is just one of yet another example. In Chapter 5, Planting Time, we get another very interesting example of their dependency on tree growth. It's about the history of the science of, like what is it? It's like plant chronology, or is it tree chronology? I want to get the term right here.
Yeah, the term is dendrochronology.
Dendrochronology. Yeah, it's the history of dendrochronology, which is the determining the age of a tree, or like its pattern of growth by analyzing the rings in the tree. But then, like, if you have a bunch of these examples, you can actually chain together a chronology, stretching back as far as you want, and you can determine like when, like for a given specimen, of wood, you can say, well, this lines up with this part of the chronology that we know of, so it's dated to this time. This initially gets its start from like a theory that the solar cycles would show up in the widths of the rings. And that turns out to be kind of a dead end, but it gives birth to this dendrochronology thing, which there's a lot here that is very interesting. But like in the end, what it ends up doing is contributing then to the precision of carbon-14 dating, because like in a very kind of complex interaction of like trying to date various things, it kind of turns out that the method of doing carbon-14 dating needed to be calibrated based on the chronologies that had been discovered from the tree rings, because the tree rings would indicate how the climate had changed over time, and that affects the rate of which carbon-14 is taken into the organic matter and so on. But like to me, a lot of this like was very interesting because it kind of highlighted like, in one way, the erased role of plants in this process, or like the study of plants in this process of getting to reliable carbon-14 dating.
Well, yeah, and like the protagonists who are engaged in sort of doing this scientific research are sort of considered to be like cranks who are investigating like a sort of disproven theory or a highly improbable theory, right? We have like Schulman is one of these researchers, and then we have his student, Libby, I believe. Yeah. These. Oh no, sorry, he wasn't a student. Yeah. So anyway, the main dendrochronologist that's being studied is Schulman, and he's just basically going around in the mountains in like the southwest U.S., like looking at archaeological sites for wood. And then like going up into the mountains and finding trees and boring, like doing these little bore samples, these little core samples that he can use to look at the rings without killing the tree, and just trying to find the right specimens that will provide a sort of comprehensive chronological record that he can use to prove this theory that there on a long enough timeline. There is a strong correlation between the tree rings and the solar cycles, right? And it's very like just this lonely scientific endeavor, very like Don Quixote, like just sort of tilting at windmills sort of thing, right? But it turns out that the result of this is that Libby, who is the scientist who discovered carbon dating, has something to verify his hypothesis about the decay of carbon-14 and its relationship to time against. And that just never would have happened if it weren't for this crank scientist doing like backyard or like backwoods empirical research, roaming the hills by himself, completely ignored by the rest of the scientific world.
Yeah, and like for a long time it seemed like Schulman's project would maybe not work out because it just couldn't get the specimens to make a long enough timeline, make a long enough chronology, because they'll have to overlap eventually, and to like stretch it back and back into the past. And like there's something about that that's very precarious. It's like, I don't know, like off the top of your head you might think like, oh, dating things, whatever, that seems like it should be fairly straightforward. But then like this is a real problem for a good long while. I was like, we just don't know. Like the information you want is just not available to you, except unless you're like Schulman and you go out looking for it and spend a long time doing that. And then even when you get to like carbon-14 dating, that had to be like calibrated against the findings from the dendrochronology to make it actually accurate, and that shifted the estimates quite a bit actually. And for some, there's like a curve that they had to compensate for.
Yeah, because of all these like atmospheric and environmental factors that adjust things, and yeah.
And it just seems like the practice of the science is on shakier footing than you'd think.
Yes, yeah, and like, you know, carbon dating is something you learn about in elementary school these days, right? As a sort of like a foundation of archaeology, a foundation of geology, a foundation of like our understanding of time as it is now. But it wouldn't have been possible without Schulman doing this crank research and then like finding out by luck these trees that are like 4,900 years old.
Without those trees, you just don't. But that's the interesting thing. With those trees are the only things that give you any indication of that stuff, right? Like they're the only organism that records. They're the only object in the world that records that kind of history. Without those, you were just flying blind. Like there's
sort of similar to the spruce used in the violins. They could only live so long because they grew in very specific climactic conditions, very like a very specific biome that starve them of nutrients, much like a bonsai tree, right? And by being starved perpetually, they had their life extended beyond the range that any other tree could have. And then, you know, you sort of have this interlude where this idiot Donald Curry comes along, and because he's too bad at taking core samples by hand, he gets some yahoos from the Forest Service to come and just cut down the oldest living being in existence.
a fucking travesty.
It's like 4,900 years old, and then some idiot shows up with a saw and cuts it down because he doesn't know what he's doing.
And all because he's a blundering fucking doofus who like trips over the core drill or whatever the fuck.
Yeah, like he can't do the drill, like the technique that Schulman was doing well enough, and so he's like, well, screw this, let's just cut the tree down and have a look inside. It's like, oh, and then they like try to like cover it up because they realize like they've done a big boo boo.
Oh, it's fucking crazy. Yeah, like a fascinating chapter. And like, yeah, everything's fucking dependent on trees in one way or the other.
Yeah, and you know, we use carbon dating all the time. We know about the method, et cetera, et cetera. But now that it's been calibrated, we don't need to think about the trees anymore at all. Like dendrochronology, who cares? Like, we don't need that anymore.
That shit gets forgotten about.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's still used in climate science quite a bit, but you know, as far as the basis for carbon dating, that story is completely forgotten.
Yeah. Chapter 6, Planting Knowledge, I found to be a bit weird. It kind of, like, it's all about banana skins and bananas and all the weird and wacky little anecdotes that this guy can think up about them.
Yeah, it's very strange because it's like, you know, the sort of framing device is his relationship with this this scientist from Kitakyushu named Tomonori, who he calls Tom. And he's like, I don't really understand anything about Japanese culture, but let me tell you about Japanese people.
Oh, I love this shit.
And it's like, It's like Japanese people just could never ask you to go out for a drink and not feel awkward about it. It's like, I think it's because you're a senior scientist. I think that's
Yeah.
why. I
They
don't
don't
think
want
it's
to hang
because
out with you.
Japanese people. Because Japanese people ask each other to go out for drinks after work all the time. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? But anyway, I mean, it's not like an essay about the Japanese. It's just like his sort of bubbling observations about Japaneseness at the beginning. And yeah, I was almost there at the same time that he was in Kitakyushu because one of my exes went to university there. But yeah, anyway, the point here is that, like, he goes out drinking with his colleague, and there's this idea that, in many cultures, it is a sort of an idiom to, sort of treat the banana peel as the slipperiest thing that you slip on in sort of comedic circumstances. But there's no, like, slipping on a banana skin expression in Japanese, according to him. Like, it's not to say I've heard such an expression, but then it's not exactly that common either, right? It's just, I think, like, I just think about, like, what do I always think about, or what most people think about these days when they think about slipping on a banana skin? They think about Mario Kart, which is a Japanese thing. So I'm like, how true is this really? But whatever. The main point here is that, Tom demands, like, some scientific evidence that the banana skin is especially slippery, and Stefano cannot provide this evidence. So he provides all kinds of sort of, like, surrounding information, but Tom's like, unless you give me that, like, coefficient of friction, I don't care what you got to say. Like, how lubricating are banana skins? That's all I want to know. It's like, if you don't give me that, I'm just going to say, and so, and so, and so. And we get, like, this basic, like, history of bananas that comes as a result of this. And I think the main point here, you might have a different idea, but I think the main point here is about New York City and banana skins, right? So bananas used to be super expensive. They were from the tropics. You couldn't reliably transport them to New York. Only rich people could eat them. Then we had refrigerated steamers that would bring bananas north, and then everybody could eat bananas, and everybody's doing great except for the people who grew the bananas, who were horribly oppressed, and still the case today. But the important thing here, aside from the way that, like, the benefits of bananas are very lopsidedly distributed, is that once everybody in New York started eating bananas, they threw banana peels everywhere. And this was causing a ton of injuries and accidents because banana peels are slippery and because they had no garbage collection in New York. It was just, there's piled garbage
Shit everywhere.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh my God.
And the solution that the New Yorkers came up with was to bring pigs into the city. And the pigs would eat the banana peels, and that would solve the garbage problem. So you just had these pigs, like, wandering the streets, like, at any given time of day, doing their pig things, and they were just, like, sort of, like, I don't know, like, citizens of New York in a way, right? And the benefit for the New Yorkers, aside from having their garbage collected, was that they could just eat the pigs when they were big enough, right? So it's like, sweet, this is great. But then some prudes got really upset because the pigs were getting down in the street. And they were like, oh no, the lady folk might start getting ideas.
You know what those broads are like,
If they see these pigs fucking in the street. Yeah. Oh dear, it's we must protect their feminine virtue and their fragile minds from this lascivious pig behavior, and so they banned all the pigs.
And then they finally get real garbage collection.
Yeah, they bring in the cops basically, and then the garbage collectors, and the point of it is that as a result of banana accidents being so common in New York, the banana as a thing you slip on gets into vaudeville theater and then becomes like a worldwide sort of famous gag. And it's this relationship between the banana tree, which isn't actually a tree, apparently. It's a bush, and the bananas are actually berries, technically speaking, which is super weird. This tree it becomes sort of a core element of popular culture, and it also sort of points at this we had a moment where we sort of had like a functioning complex biological system to deal with this problem that involves sort of like tree matter and animals and humans. And then we decided to get rid of all of it and replace it with like basically an army of people to make sure that the city nature divide is maintained.
And, landfill. It all gets moved to fucking landfill instead.
It all gets moved to a landfill, and the pigs don't get fed. So, and then we had to take 70% of agricultural land on Earth and use it to feed cows instead.
Yeah. I don't know. It then kind of semi wraps up with like there is a study that gets the slipperiness coefficient of bananas or something, and they have a good laugh about it. And then there's a weird bit at the end about like the brief thing in the 60s where everyone was trying to smoke banana skins to get high, and I don't know. This is a weird chapter.
Yeah, I think it was like basically like this is funny is the only reason that's in there is like this craze in the 60s of smoking banana skins, which is just like coincidentally spawned by the song Mellow Yellow coming out at just the right time. And everyone being convinced that bananas are psychoactive, and this somehow being related to the fact that in some cultures that bananas are considered like the fruit, the tree of knowledge. It's all just very like loosey goosey, like story time, fun time. Yeah.
Oh well. It's an amusing chapter. Chapter 7, Planting Law and Order, is ultimately about the process by which, using plant matter as evidence in court is finally taken up as like a real thing, briefly, but still isn't really a big thing these days, which you kind of find a bit surprising. It all kind of centers on like the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. Which was it the 20s or was it the 30s? So Charles Lindbergh, I think in 27, he did the big transatlantic flight from New York to Paris nonstop solo, which, got him a lot of fame and fortune and good stuff. But then a couple of years later, I think during the 30s, his infant son was abducted from the family home and ultimately found dead. And
it's 1932.
32. And the investigation and the conviction hinged on, there was like a ladder that was found kind of next to the window, that was just discarded, but it was a homemade ladder. And through the analysis of the wood in the ladder, they got their guy, basically. That was part of it. They used tracing dollar bills from the ransom to track down the probable location, and then when they found the guy, his whole home had planks missing and shit like that matched, the planks there matched the planks that were used to make the ladder. There was wood in the workshop that matched the wood in the ladder, all that kind of stuff. But submitting this as evidence was taken to be really strange at the time, and the defense really did their best to just get the shit out of here. It's crazy. You're telling me that wood is a thing you can fucking have in evidence in a courtroom? That's it's crazy talk,
Yeah, it's like the lawyer for the defendant, for the kidnapper, uh, speaks to the court about this, like whether this should be admissible evidence or not, and says something like, or says, there does not exist among men an animal known as an expert on wood, which is not a science recognized by the courts, which has nothing to do with handwriting experts, fingerprint experts, or ballistics experts. Those are some of the sciences recognized by the courts. It's just like, who do you think you are coming here as a botanist and trying to tell us what's what? This is absurd. You think you're a real scientist? And it's like, the whole chapter begins with him sort of like lamenting how like being an agronomist, which is like, the neighboring discipline to botany, is like disreputable among academics, and everyone feels bad for him for being a plant researcher of any kind because it's such a pathetic excuse for a science. And then, just like, well, look at this, back in history, like people in courts said this wasn't a real science. But fortunately, the judge in this one case did say that, in fact, the testimony was expert. So disagreed with the lawyer. But in the subsequent years, the more surprising thing is that any kind of plant sciences is basically not included in forensics. Like if you look at sort of like centers of criminal investigation and forensic expertise, you're not going to find botanists of any kind. Despite the fact that plants are like literally everywhere and could be quite indicative of like place. Yeah.
So there has been some really great success with using like pollen as a way of placing a murder or placing a location or whatever. Like there's been some pretty, like there's quoted here some really impressive cases where botany has contributed massively to solving it. But like then the Handbook of Forensic Services of the FBI mentions wood fibers once but makes no reference to any other vegetable matter, and a lot of labs just don't have botany expertise on hand. They just don't process pollen, or they do barely process anything to do with wood. So the attitude that botany is not a science is largely still alive and well.
Yeah, and my dad had to quit botany because there's no work in it because nobody takes it seriously. That's why he ended up becoming an ecologist.
Yeah, it's nuts. And then the last chapter, Planting the Moon, I think we've already basically talked about that. Tree seeds have been to the moon and back and got planted and nobody gives a shit, which is fucking weird, when you think about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's like they had this idea of doing sort of like sibling experiments between the trees that had been to, or the seeds that had been to the moon and the ones that they preserved on Earth that were like their siblings, and to see like, well, A/B testing, what changes, right? But they never even did the experiment. They were just like, I don't know, we're just going to plant these moon trees because everybody's all about the moon right now, and then we'll just forget about them. Whatever, who cares? It's very much like the Carter solar panel on the White House that got taken down in the Reagan era, but like even less famous than that.
Absolutely. It's fucking strange, right? Like, and it underscores the point, a large point of the book, that like it's really weird that we ignore these beings, despite how important they are.
Yeah, it's like the dog that was sent to space, Laika, like was like on a stamp for like the Soviet Union, right? Like really famously, or like everybody knows that story, right? About Laika, the dog that was the first living being in space. But the fact that like these were the first seeds in space, which are also living beings, and we had a bunch of trees from them everywhere, just not remembered at all, except for on that plaque. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Very strange. This is a fun little book. And is there much else to say about it? I feel like it's very fun to read, but yeah, I think we've covered pretty much everything. Yeah, I liked it. I liked it a lot. I would love to get more of the plant intelligence stuff.
Yes.
If we could.
Yeah. No, I think this is making a valid point that is sort of adjacent to the point about plant intelligence, right? It's not primarily concerned with plant intelligence. It's concerned with like how prolific plants are, how adaptive they are, and how much we ignore them. It's like that's all cool. It's good to know. I mean, I guess if you are a researcher on plants, and the only reason that people start getting interested in plants is because they have intelligence, which is a quality similar to the quality we have as animals. I guess you could understand, like, I could understand being like, well, oh, now you're interested in plants. Is that it? Because they're more like animals? Because they're more like your animal fixation? Is that why you're interested in the plants, huh? You animal obsessive? Yeah, I kind of get that vibe from this book, and the point is actually a valid point. So it's well taken, but I think we all want to know more about the plant intelligence and all of the cool stories, like trees screaming in ultrasonic frequencies that we can't hear, probably because we evolved to shut them out.
If I were a species, I think I would do that. You know?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this natural selection, like the people who are constantly hearing screaming trees, probably less good at tuning into the sounds that are more relevant to their life.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah, in the very like practical survival sense.
Yeah, I think as well. Like, I think it would be for us on the left. It would probably do as well to kind of revisit Kropotkin's mutual aid, and specifically in the context of plants, and kind of draw more lessons from there if we could, because we have evidence of beings that are very highly adapted at doing this kind of cooperation stuff and succeeding very well at it. It's kind of weird we don't, it's weird we don't pay more attention.
The thing is, like, so it's like leftists will often bring up Kropotkin, right? Like, be like, look, mutual aid, cooperation, these things are also very important to evolution, and maybe even more so. And it's like, yeah, okay, but like if you take animal evolution as the universally valid type of evolution, then at best it's kind of like yeah, but what about sort of argument, right? Like it is sort of like at best you could kind of say like, maybe these things are roughly equal, maybe the cooperation is a bit stronger, but like you can't really look at the history of humanity and say like, haha, mutual aid is the essence of human nature. Like it would just be absurd, right? Because of all the war, violence, and all the things that are horrible in history. But if it is in fact true, as this book argues, that there's overwhelming evidence of mutual aid in plant evolution, well, you can sort of shift the discussion a little bit by decentering the animals and sort of saying, well, if you look in this broader context, yes, we have these sort of competing imperatives, but the plants are much more to this mutual aid side than we as humans or as animals are, because all you got to do is like go out in a park and look at birds, and you'll see evidence of competitive behavior or rivalrous behavior between birds. Like, it's not like this is like an abhorrent like crime against nature that doesn't exist outside of like the fallen human spirit or something like that. It's like, no, there's animals competing all the time, all around us. You can see it everywhere. And it would be silly for us to try to like do some sort of like Stalinist like denial of the existence of these things, right? But it is interesting to recenter the whole discussion, or displace the whole discussion and reconceive it by taking into account, the prevalence of plants and their very different natures, and have a different conception of life that could maybe lead us to a different view of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, especially now that like climate change means we're kind of going to have to decenter ourselves anyway. Like if our project is about the preservation of life on Earth, like life on Earth is mostly not us. And so we're going to have to swallow our egos in that kind of sense as well. And, pay a bit more attention to how life in general works, which turns out we're a pretty strange exception and not the actual model. And we shouldn't be, we should be paying much more attention to how living beings in general actually function and what they need to live.
Yeah, it would be the rational thing to do.
Thank you for listening to General Intellect Unit. While you wait for the next episode, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. You can find us on Facebook and all the podcast apps, so like, rate and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show and get access to our community Discord, you can go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and give us a couple of bucks a month. Every contribution is greatly appreciated. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows such as Swampside Chats, From Alpha to Omega, Mortal Science, and Chimsuit Utopia. They're all excellent shows and excellent folks. Once again, thanks for listening. We really appreciate everyone who came along with us for these first 100 episodes, and we hope you'll stay with us for the next 100.